The Opium Wars, two of the most pivotal conflicts in Chinese history, were not just battles for land, but also for economic and political control. These wars, particularly the First Opium War, marked a turning point in global history. At their core, they were about more than just opium, the drug that fueled so much conflict. They were about the clash between two very different worldviews, one rooted in centuries-old tradition and sovereignty, the other in the expansionist desires of a rapidly industrializing empire. In this video, we are going to dive deep into the First Opium War, exploring not just the military tactics, but also the human cost, the social repercussions, and the long-lasting consequences of this devastating chapter in history. The backdrop of the Opium Wars was a world undergoing significant change. Europe, particularly Britain, had entered an age of global exploration, imperialism, and industrialization. Trade was booming, and Europe's growing thirst for luxury goods like Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain was insatiable. However, the balance of trade between China and Britain was deeply skewed in China's favor. The Chinese, proud of their culture and self-sufficient in many areas, were not interested in the goods Britain had to offer. This created a massive trade imbalance that put Britain's economy in jeopardy. But rather than adjusting its own trade policies or finding alternative markets, Britain, ever resourceful, turned to opium, a potent, addictive drug, as a solution. Opium was produced in India under the control of the British East India Company and was sold to China in exchange for silver. The drug quickly spread throughout Chinese society, with devastating social, economic, and political consequences. The Qing dynasty, which had been in power for centuries, was faced with a rapidly growing addiction problem among its people, and the government was desperate to stop the trade. At the heart of China's anti-opium campaign was Commissioner Lin Zexu, a determined and principled official tasked with curbing the opium trade. Lin's actions would set the stage for one of the most dramatic and tragic conflicts in China's history. In 1839, Lin Zexu took bold and unprecedented action by confiscating and destroying over 20,000 crates of British opium. This was not just an attack on the British drug trade. It was an assault on British imperial interests. Lin's actions were seen as an act of defiance against the British Empire, and the response from Britain was swift and brutal. The British government, already seeking to assert its dominance over China, saw this as a direct challenge to its economic interests. Britain's response would change the course of history. The British Navy, the most powerful in the world at the time, sailed to China's shores. The Qing dynasty's military forces, though large in number, were no match for Britain's advanced naval technology and modern tactics. The British, confident in their superior military capabilities, quickly began to attack China's coastal defenses. The war that ensued was not just about opium. It was a brutal struggle between two empires, each with its own sense of righteousness. For China, this war was about preserving sovereignty, tradition, and moral values. For Britain, it was about maintaining economic power, securing trade routes, and ensuring its grip on the global market. The military tactics employed by both sides in the conflict were starkly different. The British relied on their naval superiority, using steam-powered warships to bomb Chinese ports and fortifications from a distance. Their strategic goal was to force China to open its ports and recognize British trade rights, specifically the right to trade opium freely. The Qing forces, despite their numbers, were caught off guard by the efficiency and power of the British military. Battles were fought in the waters off China's coast, with the British Navy seizing key ports, including the strategic city of Canton. But the conflict was not just about military strategy. It was about the very soul of China, and the human toll that war inevitably brings. The destruction of opium shipments, while seen as a victory by many Chinese, was a catalyst for a war that would devastate countless lives. Cities were bombarded, families were torn apart, and an entire way of life was disrupted. The opium trade itself had already caused immense harm, and the war brought even more suffering. Civilians caught in the crossfire of the conflict faced famine, disease, and displacement. The social fabric of China was unraveling under the weight of imperialism and internal strife. In the midst of this chaos, it was not just the military leaders who were affected. Ordinary people, caught in the struggle for survival, experienced the war's impact firsthand. In Canton, where the fighting was particularly intense, civilians struggled to make sense of the conflict that had come to their doorstep. Their lives were upended, and the war took its toll, not just in physical destruction, but in the psychological trauma that would linger long after the battles were over. The story of the Opium War is, in many ways, the story of human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It is about how ordinary people endured suffering, loss, and displacement, all while witnessing the rise of imperial power and the erosion of their sovereignty. The war culminated in the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, which marked the end of the First Opium War, but set the stage for more unequal treaties between China and foreign powers. The treaty forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 key ports to foreign trade, and pay reparations. It also legalized the opium trade, which would continue to wreak havoc on China's society for decades to come. The Treaty of Nanjing was a symbolic moment in Chinese history, an undeniable marker of the country's subjugation to foreign powers. For many Chinese, it marked the beginning of the century of humiliation, a period that would see China forced to submit to Western imperialism in various forms, until the rise of communism in the 20th century. As we dive deeper into the First Opium War, we will examine how the war was not just a military conflict, but a profound moment of cultural and ideological clash. We will look at the human cost of the war, the lives lost, the families torn apart, and the lasting psychological scars left on both the Chinese and British peoples. Through personal analysis, real-life stories, and historical insights, we will explore how opium, once a mere commodity, became a weapon of imperialism, leaving a legacy that would shape the future of China and the world for generations to come. In the early 19th century, the British Empire was on a mission to expand its influence, and China stood as the last great holdout in their quest for global dominance. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for centuries, held firm in its resistance to foreign influence, especially from European powers. China had long maintained a policy of isolation, focusing on its own cultural, political, and economic stability. The empire had limited trade relationships with the West, but these were strictly controlled, and China was selective about the goods it traded. European powers, particularly Britain, were eager to access the rich and diverse resources of China, such as silk, tea, and porcelain luxuries that were in high demand in Europe. However, the Qing dynasty's policy of self-sufficiency and its reluctance to engage in substantial trade with Europe created an imbalanced economic relationship. While Britain was desperate to import Chinese goods, China had little interest in European products, and when it did, it expected payment in silver. This led to a serious trade imbalance. The British, whose own economy was heavily dependent on trade, found themselves in a bind. They were rapidly depleting their silver reserves to pay for Chinese goods, and the economic strain was starting to show. In their quest to fix this trade deficit, the British turned to an alternative solution that would change the course of history: opium. The British East India Company, which had already established a profitable monopoly on opium production in India, began importing vast quantities of the drug into China. Opium was a product the Chinese had no initial interest in, but its addictive properties quickly made it a highly profitable commodity. The British saw opium as the perfect solution. It was both a valuable good to trade and a way to reverse the growing silver deficit. As opium spread throughout China, it wreaked havoc on the social and economic fabric of society, feeding an addiction that ensnared millions of Chinese citizens. The social effects were devastating. The demand for opium surged, leading to a situation where countless Chinese became addicted and entire regions fell into despair. Farmers turned to growing opium poppies instead of food crops, further destabilizing local economies. While British merchants and the East India Company reaped enormous profits, the Chinese people suffered the consequences. Opium's grip on Chinese society was deepening, and its effects were becoming impossible to ignore. Addiction led to widespread poverty, family breakdowns, and a rising sense of helplessness among the Chinese populace. The Chinese government, led by the increasingly determined Commissioner Lin Zexu, saw the destructive effects of the opium trade on its people and knew that something had to be done. Lin was appointed by the Qing Emperor to tackle the opium crisis head-on, and he wasted no time in making his stance clear. In 1839, Lin took bold and drastic action. He seized and destroyed more than 20,000 crates of opium worth millions of silver taels that had been smuggled into Canton, now Guangzhou. This was a direct assault on British economic interests and was seen by many in Britain as an unforgivable provocation. Lin's actions were not just a symbolic gesture. They were a statement of China's sovereignty. He believed that the opium trade was a cancer on Chinese society, one that needed to be eradicated for the good of the people. But this act of defiance had enormous consequences. The British, whose economy had become increasingly reliant on the opium trade, could not afford to let such a bold challenge go unanswered. The destruction of the opium represented not only a loss of revenue, but also an attack on British prestige and the economic foundations of their empire. Britain's response was swift and brutal. The British government, under pressure from the East India Company and merchants who had been profiting from the trade, decided that they would use military force to ensure that China opened its markets to foreign trade and allowed the opium trade to continue unimpeded. Britain's response would set the stage for the First Opium War, a conflict that would change the balance of power between East and West forever. The British military, with its naval superiority and advanced technology, quickly launched an assault on Chinese coastal defenses. The Qing dynasty, despite its size and historical strength, was ill-prepared for the modern warfare that the British brought to its shores. British warships, equipped with steam power and heavy artillery, easily outclassed the Chinese navy. British troops captured key Chinese cities and ports, including Canton, in a series of decisive battles. The Qing dynasty's military might, while vast, was ineffective against Britain's superior naval forces. The First Opium War was not just about opium. It was a clash between two civilizations with vastly different values. On one side was the British Empire, driven by industrialization, economic interests, and imperial expansion. On the other side was China, an ancient civilization determined to maintain its sovereignty and protect its people from the devastating effects of foreign influence. For China, the war was not just a struggle for economic survival. It was a fight to preserve its cultural and moral values in the face of an aggressive imperial power This struggle culminated in the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, which marked the end of the First Opium War, but also marked the beginning of China's painful era of subjugation to Western powers. The treaty, signed under duress, forced China to make significant concessions to Britain, including the cession of Hong Kong, the opening of 5 key ports to British trade, and the payment of reparations. The treaty also legalized the opium trade, ensuring that British merchants could continue to profit from the sale of the drug in China. For many Chinese, the Treaty of Nanjing was seen as a national humiliation, a symbol of China's vulnerability to foreign powers and the beginning of what the Chinese call the century of humiliation. The human cost of this war was enormous. Thousands of lives were lost in the fighting, and the social consequences of the opium trade would haunt China for generations. Opium addiction ravaged families, destabilized entire regions, and eroded the moral fabric of society. But the long-term effects of the war were just as profound. The First Opium War exposed China's weaknesses. Setting the stage for further foreign intervention and exploitation, it marked the beginning of a new era in Chinese history, one in which imperial powers would continue to exert their influence and control over the country. The First Opium War was a turning point in world history, one that changed the course of China's development and shaped the trajectory of global trade and imperialism. While the immediate cause of the war was the opium trade, the deeper issue was the clash of civilizations, the struggle for economic dominance, and the price that would be paid by both sides. The consequences of this war reverberated throughout history, leaving a lasting legacy that would influence China's foreign policy and national identity for generations to come. One of the most fascinating aspects of the First Opium War is the personal stories that emerged from this tumultuous period, stories that not only illustrate the human cost of imperialism, but also highlight the resilience of individuals caught in the clash of civilizations. Among these figures, one stands out above the rest, Commissioner Lin Zexu. Lin's story is not just one of courage and conviction. It is also one of immense tragedy, highlighting the internal conflict that China faced during this era. Lin's unwavering determination to eradicate opium from China would make him a symbol of resistance to imperialism, but it would come at a personal cost that would reverberate throughout his life. At the time, China was deeply entrenched in its traditional values. The Qing dynasty had ruled for centuries, and the empire was built upon a foundation of cultural preservation and self-sufficiency. However, as Western powers, particularly Britain, began encroaching on China's borders with their insidious trade practices, this foundation was being threatened. The opium trade, which Britain had introduced into China through the British East India Company, had begun to take a devastating toll on Chinese society. Addiction was spreading like wildfire, and the Chinese government was struggling to maintain control. In this moment of crisis, Lin Zexu rose as one of the most influential and principled leaders in China's history. Lin Zexu was appointed by the Qing Emperor as the imperial commissioner in Canton in 1839, tasked with dealing with the opium crisis that had plagued China for years. Lin was a man of strong moral convictions, a scholar, and a patriot who believed firmly in the preservation of Chinese sovereignty and values. He saw the opium trade not just as a threat to public health, but as an attack on China's dignity. His appointment to deal with the opium issue was not just a political move, it was a reflection of the serious commitment the Qing government had to eradicating this foreign influence that was poisoning their society. In a series of decisive actions that would go down in history, Lin Zexu embarked on a campaign to destroy opium supplies throughout southern China. His most dramatic act of defiance came when he seized and destroyed over 20,000 crates of British opium in Canton. This move was not just a symbol of resistance, it was a direct challenge to British imperialism, an assertion that China would no longer tolerate the foreign drug trade. For Lin, this was not just about public health. It was a fight for the soul of China, a stand against foreign exploitation that threatened to destabilize the very fabric of Chinese society. However, Lin's actions had severe consequences. To the British, his actions were an unforgivable affront to their economic interests and imperial pride. The destruction of the opium shipments represented a direct attack on British merchants who relied on the drug trade for their livelihoods. In retaliation, the British government, backed by the powerful East India Company, prepared to use military force to ensure that their economic agenda was not derailed. The First Opium War would soon be upon them. Lin Zexu's refusal to compromise with the British marked him as a hero to many in China, but it also made him a target of the Qing court. The emperor, while sympathetic to Lin's cause, feared the repercussions of war with Britain. Lin's uncompromising stance, while seen as noble and patriotic by many, was ultimately viewed as too radical by some factions within the Qing leadership. In a devastating blow, Lin was blamed for the conflict and exiled to the farthest reaches of China, far from the political center of power. His exile was not just a punishment for his defiance, but also a reflection of the deep internal conflict China faced at the time. Should the country preserve its traditional values and resist foreign influence, or should it open up to modernization and foreign trade to survive in an increasingly globalized world? Lin's exile was a personal tragedy, but it also served as a powerful symbol of the larger struggle China faced. His punishment highlighted the tensions within the Qing dynasty between those who wanted to preserve China's traditional way of life and those who recognized that some level of reform was necessary to prevent the country from being left behind by the West. Lin's vision of a self-sufficient and morally upright China, free from the scourge of opium and foreign control, clashed with the pragmatic needs of a country facing immense pressure from imperial powers. Lin's tragedy was not just that he was exiled, it was that he represented the last stand of an old China that could not hold back the tide of imperialism. Despite his exile, Lin Zexu's legacy lived on, and his efforts to eradicate opium continued to resonate throughout Chinese history. His actions inspired generations of Chinese reformers, nationalists, and revolutionaries who would later fight for the sovereignty and independence of their country. Lin's vision of a China free from foreign domination and internal corruption became a rallying cry during the later years of the Qing dynasty, the Republican era, and even the early years of the People's Republic of China. The tragedy of Lin Zexu's life and his uncompromising stance against the opium trade provides a window into the larger struggles of China during the 19th century. His story is emblematic of the deep internal conflict that plagued the Qing dynasty as it faced the realities of imperialism and modernization. While Lin's personal story was one of sacrifice and suffering, it also marked the beginning of China's long journey toward reform and renewal. His life serves as a reminder that resistance, though often costly, can inspire profound change both in the individual and the nation. Lin Zexu's legacy continues to symbolize the courage and determination of a people struggling to preserve their identity in the face of overwhelming foreign pressure, making him a figure whose story transcends the past and continues to resonate with China's modern struggles for sovereignty and self-determination. Lin Zexu's life remains a testament to the power of personal conviction, a story of how one individual's stand against imperialism can become a beacon of resistance and hope. His refusal to compromise, His destruction of British opium shipments and his ultimate exile are tragic, but they also reflect the deep moral struggle that China faced as it was forced to navigate the challenges of modernization and foreign encroachment. The story of Lin Zexu is a powerful reminder that the pursuit of national sovereignty and moral integrity often comes at a great personal cost. And in this case, the personal tragedy of one man helped ignite the larger movement that would eventually shape modern China. From the British perspective, the opium trade was not merely an economic transaction. It was a lifeline, a vital artery that kept the British Empire's economy thriving in the 19th century. As the Industrial Revolution rapidly transformed Britain into the world's most powerful nation, its empire sought new markets and new ways to fuel its ever-growing economic engine. The British East India Company, which controlled vast swaths of territory in India, held a near monopoly over the opium trade. This opium, produced in India and shipped to China, became a key commodity, integral not just for the profit of merchants, but for the very functioning of Britain's global trade network. The profits reaped from the sale of opium were critical for Britain, especially as it grappled with the economic realities of a growing empire. Britain was importing vast quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain luxuries that were highly prized in Europe. However, China was not interested in British goods. They had little need for European products, and the Qing government insisted on silver as payment for their goods. By the 19th century, this created a significant trade imbalance, draining Britain's silver reserves and putting pressure on its economy. To resolve this imbalance, the British turned to opium, a product that not only filled the coffers of the East India Company, but also reversed the flow of silver. The addictive nature of opium meant that its trade would become increasingly profitable. Opium was smuggled into China through various ports, including Canton, where the British East India Company had established strong ties with local merchants. As the addiction spread, so too did the profits. For Britain, this was not just about supplying a demand for goods. It was about preserving economic control over China, a nation that, up until then, had been largely resistant to foreign trade. However, while the British were looking to secure their economic dominance, China found itself facing a moral and social crisis. The influx of opium was devastating. It was ravaging families, draining the nation of its resources, and wreaking havoc on the fabric of society. Addiction was tearing communities apart, and the Chinese government was under increasing pressure to act. Commissioner Lin Zexu, the imperial official tasked with eradicating the opium problem, took a stand that would set the stage for the brutal conflict that would follow. For China, the opium trade was not just an economic issue. It was a matter of national integrity and the preservation of its values. Lin's aggressive actions to seize and destroy over 20,000 crates of opium in 1839 were a direct challenge to Britain's imperial interests. Lin's goal was to protect the Chinese people from the devastating effects of opium, but the British saw this as a direct affront to their lucrative trade. At the heart of the conflict was a stark contrast in priorities. While China sought to preserve its culture and protect its citizens from the corrosive effects of opium, Britain was focused on maintaining its dominance in global trade. To secure this, Britain turned to military force, believing that their naval superiority would give them the leverage they needed to open China's markets and protect their opium trade. The British government, driven by the interests of the East India Company and its merchants, was prepared to use violence to ensure that its economic needs were met. The British military response to China's crackdown on opium was swift and overwhelming. The Royal Navy, the most powerful naval force in the world, was mobilized to strike at China's coastal cities. The British knew that their military superiority backed by steam-powered warships, modern artillery, and an experienced army, would easily overpower the Qing forces, who were ill-prepared for such an advanced military campaign. Britain's strategy was simple: to force China into submission, using military might to extract trade concessions and ensure the continuation of the opium trade. The First Opium War was, at its core, a war of imperial conquest, a battle for economic dominance. The British were not simply interested in protecting their trade routes. They wanted to assert their imperial will over China. The war would result in a series of unequal treaties, agreements that were imposed on China by Western powers under the threat of further military action. The most infamous of these treaties was the Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, which marked the official end of the First Opium War, but also represented a devastating blow to China's sovereignty. The Treaty of Nanjing was not just a diplomatic agreement. It was a humiliating imposition of British power over a weakened China. The treaty forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain, effectively turning it into a British colony. It also required China to open 5 key ports: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, allowing British merchants to trade freely and without restriction. Furthermore, China was compelled to pay a hefty indemnity to Britain, compensating the British government and East India Company for the losses incurred during the war. The treaty also legalized the opium trade, ensuring that the British could continue their lucrative business without further interference from the Chinese government. The Treaty of Nanjing was the first of many unequal treaties that China would be forced to sign throughout the 19th century. These treaties marked the beginning of what the Chinese would later call the Century of Humiliation, a period in which China was subjected to foreign domination and exploitation. The war had far-reaching consequences for China, not only in terms of territorial concessions, but also in terms of national pride and identity. The opium trade, which had initially been resisted by the Qing dynasty, would now be legalized, and China's sovereignty would continue to erode under the pressure of foreign powers. For Britain, the First Opium War was a victory, but it was a victory built on coercion and exploitation. The opium trade, which had been a crucial lifeline for Britain's economy, would continue to flow into China, bringing with it a new wave of addiction, social instability, and suffering for the Chinese people. But for Britain, it was a necessary price to pay to maintain their dominance in global trade. The war, and the Treaty of Nanjing that followed, revealed the deeply entrenched imperial mindset of the British Empire. It demonstrated how, for Britain, economic interests often trumped human rights and moral considerations. Britain's military superiority, combined with its economic ambitions, forced China to yield to Western demands, setting the stage for decades of foreign intervention and exploitation. In the aftermath of the war, the British Empire's position as the world's most powerful colonial power was solidified. But for China, the legacy of the First Opium War and the subsequent treaties would have lasting repercussions. The opium trade continued to flourish, and China's struggle to regain its sovereignty would remain a central theme in its modern history. The First Opium War, and the treaties it spawned, marked a critical turning point in the relationship between the East and the West. It was a battle not just for territory or resources, but for control over a nation's future. For China, the war symbolized the clash between traditional values and the pressures of imperialism, a clash that would shape the nation's course for generations to come. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, marked the formal end of the First Opium War, but it also opened a Pandora's box for China, unleashing a cascade of consequences that would affect the nation for decades to come. While the treaty was hailed as a victory by Britain, it was a devastating loss for China. The treaty forced China to make enormous concessions, which altered the course of its history forever. Not only did China have to cede the strategic island of Hong Kong to Britain, but it was also compelled to open 5 major ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, to foreign trade, effectively dismantling China's centuries-old system of self-imposed isolation. Additionally, China was required to pay reparations amounting to millions of silver taels, compensating Britain for the losses it had incurred during the war. In theory, the treaty's provision to halt the opium trade appeared to be a win for China, but the damage had already been done. The opium trade had already devastated Chinese society, causing widespread addiction, economic destabilization, and social unrest. Even after the treaty, the opium trade did not truly stop. It merely continued under a different guise. Britain's economic interests had been firmly established in China, and opium remained a crucial part of the empire's economic engine. While the treaty claimed to address the opium issue, it did little to curtail the drug's widespread effects on Chinese society. The British, having secured their commercial foothold in China, were able to extract greater profits from their newly acquired privileges, leaving the Chinese people to suffer the long-term consequences. The Treaty of Nanjing did not just mark the end of a war. It marked the beginning of what the Chinese would come to call the century of humiliation. This term refers to the period of time during which China was subjected to foreign domination and interference. It was a time of repeated military defeats, unfair treaties, and the erosion of China's sovereignty. While the Opium War was a catalyst, it was far from the only foreign incursion that China would experience during this period. Over the next several decades, China would face multiple invasions, economic exploitation, and territorial losses to European powers, Japan, and the United States. The treaties signed during this time often favored foreign powers and left China politically weakened and economically drained. The social and cultural impact of the Treaty of Nanjing and the subsequent treaties was profound. The Chinese people, once proud of their civilization's dominance in East Asia, now found themselves at the mercy of Western powers. The opium trade had already sown deep social and economic divisions, and the terms of the treaty only worsened the situation. The once isolated nation, which had been the dominant force in the region for centuries, was now being carved up by foreign powers that cared little for the well-being of the Chinese people. The loss of Hong Kong, a key maritime hub, further humiliated China and served as a symbol of its diminished status in the world. The port cities open to foreign trade became economic centers dominated by Western merchants, and China's own merchants and traders were marginalized, further exacerbating the nation's economic instability. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Treaty of Nanjing was its psychological toll on the Chinese people. The treaty shattered China's sense of invincibility and pride. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for over 2 centuries, struggled to reconcile its desire to maintain traditional authority with the growing pressure to modernize in the face of foreign aggression. The war and its aftermath revealed the inherent weaknesses within the Qing regime. Despite its vast territory and ancient heritage, China was unable to defend itself from the overwhelming military power of the British Empire. This realization led to widespread disillusionment and unrest, as the people of China began to question the leadership of the Qing emperors. In the years that followed the Treaty of Nanjing, China saw widespread uprisings and revolts, the most significant being the Taiping Rebellion 1850-1864. The rebellion, Fueled by dissatisfaction with the Qing dynasty's inability to protect China's sovereignty and stem the tide of foreign influence, resulted in the deaths of millions and further destabilized the country. The rebellions, combined with the relentless pressure from foreign powers, left China deeply fragmented and vulnerable to further exploitation. The Treaty of Nanjing and the resulting era of humiliation left scars that would take generations to heal. The effects of the First Opium War rippled through Chinese society, politics, and culture for over a century. Even after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, China continued to struggle with the legacy of imperialism as foreign influence persisted in various forms. The psychological impact of the century of humiliation fueled nationalist movements in China, leading to the rise of the Chinese Communist Party and the eventual establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. For many Chinese, this period of foreign domination became a defining moment in their national identity, a reminder of the price of foreign interference and the importance of maintaining sovereignty. The Treaty of Nanjing was not just a diplomatic agreement. It was a symbol of the profound shift in China's place in the world. It signified the beginning of a new era in which China would be forced to confront the power dynamics of the modern world, a world that was increasingly shaped by imperialism and industrialization. The war and the treaty exposed China's vulnerabilities, but it also sparked a drive for reform that would eventually lead to the nation's modernization. The legacy of the Treaty of Nanjing and the First Opium War is still felt in China today. The trauma of this period has left an indelible mark on the nation's collective memory, shaping China's foreign policy, its national identity, and its drive for modernization. The events that unfolded in the 19th century laid the groundwork for China's emergence as a global power in the 20th and 21st centuries, as the country sought to reclaim its place on the world stage and ensure that it would never again be subjected to the humiliation and exploitation of foreign imperial powers. The scars of the past may never fully heal, but they have certainly shaped the resilient and proud nation that China is today. The impact of the First Opium War was far-reaching, not just for China, but also for the broader world. The power dynamics shifted dramatically as the Qing dynasty, once the dominant force in East Asia, lost face and territorial control to Western powers. The war, which had begun over the opium trade, quickly became a larger struggle for global influence. The British, with their superior naval power, used the conflict as a springboard to impose their will on China, forever altering the balance of power in the region. For China, the consequences were profound. The war marked the beginning of a long and painful period of subjugation to foreign interests, a period that the Chinese would later refer to as the Century of Humiliation. The Qing dynasty, long regarded as a symbol of China's strength and unity, had been humbled by the British military. The loss of Hong Kong to Britain, the opening of key ports to foreign trade, and the imposition of indemnities under the Treaty of Nanjing, all served as stark reminders of China's inability to defend itself against Western imperialism. The treaty did not merely signify a diplomatic defeat. It was a brutal blow to China's sovereignty and its pride. The aftermath of the war set the stage for decades of foreign intervention in China, which would continue to erode the Qing dynasty's control. With the Treaty of Nanjing, Britain gained control over Hong Kong, establishing a colonial foothold that would remain until 1997. Moreover, the treaty forced China to open its ports to foreign trade, a move that drastically reshaped the economic landscape of the country. Western powers, including Britain, France, the United States, and later Japan, set up their own spheres of influence within China, further undermining the Qing government's authority. This shift in power was not just political, it was cultural as well. The Western imposition of foreign trade, legal systems, and even religion left a deep mark on Chinese society. The Qing dynasty's loss of face during the war was felt not only by the ruling elite, but also by the broader population. The Chinese people, who had once viewed their empire as the center of the world, now found themselves humiliated and subjugated. The loss of Hong Kong and the opening of treaty ports to foreign trade were seen as an affront to Chinese sovereignty. This humiliation was compounded by the growing social unrest caused by the widespread addiction to opium. As foreign influence expanded, the Qing government's ability to govern effectively and protect its people became increasingly compromised. The First Opium War also had a ripple effect across the world, particularly in the context of Western imperialism. For Britain, the war marked the successful extension of its global dominance, particularly in Asia. By forcing China to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, Britain secured a steady flow of opium trade, along with the opening of key markets for British goods. The success of the British in China served as a model for other Western powers, who sought to extend their influence in China and other parts of Asia. The opium trade, once a hidden aspect of British imperialism, became a symbol of Western exploitation and dominance in the East. As Western powers jockeyed for control of China, other regions of the world were witnessing similar shifts in power. The success of Britain in China emboldened other colonial powers, particularly in Africa and Asia, who sought to carve out their own spheres of influence. The scramble for control over trade routes, territories, and resources became a central theme in the age of imperialism. For China, the First Opium War was not just a defeat at the hands of the British, it was the beginning of a broader global shift in which Western powers increasingly dictated the terms of international relations. The internal impact of the war on China was equally profound. The defeat and the humiliation of the Qing dynasty contributed to growing dissatisfaction among the Chinese people. The Qing government's inability to protect China from foreign domination led to widespread unrest, culminating in the Taiping Rebellion 185-01864, one of the deadliest uprisings in history. Millions of people died as a result of the rebellion, which was fueled by a desire for reform and a rejection of the Qing dynasty's weakness. The rebellion, along with other uprisings and movements, reflected the deep discontent with the Qing government and the growing desire for change in the face of foreign aggression. The First Opium War also sowed the seeds for the eventual collapse of the Qing dynasty. While the Qing government initially responded to foreign encroachment by trying to suppress internal dissent and maintain traditional order, it became increasingly clear that China's traditional systems were ill-equipped to cope with the challenges posed by Western powers. As foreign influence grew, so too did the desire for reform, modernization, and a reassertion of Chinese sovereignty. This desire would eventually give rise to movements like the self-strengthening movement, which sought to modernize China's military and history. But it came too late to prevent the downfall of the Qing dynasty. The Treaty of Nanjing and the First Opium War also played a key role in shaping China's relationship with the West for decades to come. The unequal treaties that followed the First Opium War set a precedent for future diplomatic and trade relations, and China's humiliation became a driving force behind nationalist movements that sought to expel foreign influence and restore China's sovereignty. In the 20th century, the legacy of the Opium War would be invoked by leaders like Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, who sought to restore China's national dignity and power in the face of foreign imperialism. The First Opium War reshaped the global landscape in ways that were far beyond the intentions of the British Empire. While the immediate effects of the war were felt in China, its reverberations were felt across the world. The war marked the start of a new era of imperialism, one in which Western powers asserted their dominance over weaker nations. For China, it was the beginning of a long and painful struggle to reclaim its sovereignty and restore its pride. The century of humiliation that followed the war would leave a deep scar on China's national consciousness, but it also served as a catalyst for the reform movements and nationalist movements that would eventually lead to China's emergence as a global power in the 20th and 21st centuries. The First Opium War and its aftermath was a pivotal moment in history that changed the course of China's future and reshaped the global balance of power for generations to come. The legacy of the Opium Wars is still profoundly felt in China today. The wars, which were not just about the opium trade but also about the larger battle for control and sovereignty, caused massive social, economic, and political upheaval. The impact was so deep that it reshaped Chinese society in ways that are still visible in modern China's outlook, its government, and its policies. The Opium Wars set the stage for movements toward reform and modernization, igniting a transformation in China's internal structure and its place on the global stage. The Qing dynasty's defeat during the First and Second Opium Wars led directly to the fall of one of China's longest-reigning imperial families. The humiliation suffered by the Qing government, which was seen as weak and incapable of defending China's sovereignty, sparked widespread dissatisfaction across the nation. The social fabric of China, already strained due to the opium epidemic, was further shattered by foreign exploitation and territorial concessions. This instability set the stage for the downfall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, marking the end of over 2 millennia of imperial rule in China. The collapse of the Qing dynasty led to the establishment of the Republic of China. The Republican era, however, was one marked by internal strife, warlordism, and foreign intervention, as various factions vied for control of a fractured nation. Yet the fall of the Qing and the rise of the Republic also served as a pivot toward modernization. The events of the Opium Wars highlighted China's weaknesses and propelled the nation toward the idea that significant reform was needed to resist further domination by foreign powers. The lessons of the Opium Wars were not lost on the Chinese people. They understood that their inability to defend themselves in the face of foreign imperialism had led to the loss of precious territory and the destabilization of their society. The Treaty of Nanjing, which opened Chinese ports to foreign trade, ceded Hong Kong to Britain, and forced China into the opium trade, became a powerful symbol of the nation's humiliation. The Opium Wars and the unequal treaties that followed left China deeply scarred. But from this pain arose a fervent desire for national sovereignty and self-strengthening. As the Republican era gave way to the rise of the Chinese Communist Party CCP in the mid-20th century, the legacy of the Opium Wars continued to influence Chinese thought and foreign policy. The CCP, led by figures like Mao Zedong, would later frame the struggles against imperialism as a cornerstone of their political ideology. The humiliation suffered during the Opium Wars became a rallying cry for the Chinese people, who sought to free themselves from foreign influence and establish a strong, unified China. One of the most poignant lessons from the Opium Wars lies in the struggle for sovereignty, a theme that would become central to China's foreign policy throughout the 20th century and beyond. The wars taught China that its survival as an independent and powerful nation required the ability to protect its borders and its people from external threats. This focus on sovereignty led to a profound shift in China's political landscape, as the country sought not only to modernize, but to assert its rightful place as a global power. China's foreign policy throughout the 20th century, especially under the CCP, was largely shaped by the lessons learned from the Opium Wars. The quest for self-strengthening became paramount, leading to initiatives focused on industrialization, military modernization, and the reform of social institutions. The humiliations suffered at the hands of foreign powers during the 19th century would forever color China's diplomatic approach, pushing the country to resist foreign influence and to rebuild its national pride. In the post-World War II era, China's foreign policy focused on reclaiming its dignity and sovereignty. The success of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, which culminated in the establishment of the People's Republic of China (PRC), marked a significant shift away from the historical period of foreign domination. For the Chinese leadership, the goal was not only to consolidate power internally, but to restore China's stature on the global stage. The trauma of the Opium Wars was never far from the minds of Chinese leaders, who sought to prevent any future foreign encroachment and to build a self-sufficient, powerful nation that could stand on equal footing with the West. The trauma of the Opium Wars and the subsequent century of humiliation also shaped China's relationships with other countries. The desire to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past led to a foreign policy that prioritized national sovereignty and resistance to imperialism. China's modern stance on issues like Taiwan, the South China Sea, and its approach to global trade are all influenced by the historical memory of foreign exploitation. In many ways, China's emphasis on protecting its sovereignty and its resistance to external pressures reflect a desire to reclaim the autonomy that was lost during the Opium Wars. However, it was not just in the realm of foreign policy that the legacy of the Opium Wars left a mark. Domestically, the wars and their aftermath sparked major efforts at reform within China. During the late Qing and early Republican periods, China attempted various reforms to modernize its military, economy, and social structures. The self-strengthening movement, initiated in the late 19th century, was an effort to modernize China's military and industry to prevent future foreign exploitation. Although this movement had limited success, it laid the groundwork for future modernization efforts. The legacy of the Opium Wars, particularly the recognition of China's vulnerabilities, pushed reformers to look at the country's weaknesses and strive for modernization. Moreover, the Opium Wars and their consequences set in motion a slow but steady transformation in Chinese society. The wars created an urgent need for new education systems, which would later form the basis of China's modern educational reforms. The social divisions created by the opium trade, as well as the economic consequences of the wars, drove China to create more inclusive economic policies in the 20th century. This focus on reform and modernization was, in part, a direct response to the immense damage done by foreign powers during the Opium Wars. The aftermath of the Opium Wars also had a profound effect on Chinese culture and national identity. The wars sparked a strong sense of nationalism, with a growing belief that China's future depended on self-sufficiency and unity. The desire to reclaim national pride and dignity became central to the Chinese identity, and this sentiment would continue to influence China's political and cultural movements throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. In conclusion, the Opium Wars were a critical turning point in China's history. The wars left a deep and lasting legacy, shaping China's foreign policy, domestic reforms, and national identity for generations. From the ashes of humiliation arose a determined, reform-minded nation focused on self-strengthening and resistance to foreign influence. The events of the 19th century not only reshaped China's trajectory, but also served as a catalyst for the emergence of a modern, powerful China that would eventually reclaim its place as a major player on the global stage. The legacy of the Opium Wars remains a powerful reminder of the importance of sovereignty, independence, and national pride in the face of overwhelming foreign pressure. The Opium Wars were more than just military conflicts. They were battles for identity, power, and survival. For China, these wars marked the beginning of a painful era of subjugation to foreign hobos, an era that left deep scars on its national consciousness. The Opium Wars represented a stark turning point in China's long history, signaling the collapse of its ancient worldview and the painful entry into the modern world, dominated by imperialist powers. But within the ashes of defeat, a fierce resistance was born, a resistance that would lay the groundwork for the rise of modern China. As we reflect on the legacy of the Opium Wars, it is crucial to understand the profound lessons they imparted, not just for China, but for the broader world. These wars are a powerful reminder of the consequences of unchecked imperialism, the importance of national identity, and the resilience of a people determined to regain control over their destiny. At the core of the Opium Wars was the collision of two vastly different worlds. On one side stood the British Empire, eager to expand its reach, enforce its economic interests, and maintain its dominance over global trade. On the other side was China, a civilization with thousands of years of history, proud of its traditions and unwilling to bow to foreign influence. When Britain sought to force China to open its doors to opium, a product that had already begun to poison Chinese society, the result was a devastating conflict that would reverberate through history. The wars were not just about opium. They were about power, about the right of one nation to dictate the terms of another's future. For China, the wars exposed its vulnerabilities. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for centuries, was now under assault from a world that was rapidly industrializing and militarizing. China's traditional ways of governance, its reliance on ancient philosophies, and its self-imposed isolation were no match for the modern naval and military powers of the West. The Treaty of Nanjing, which ended the First Opium War, was not just a peace agreement. It was a humiliation that shattered China's sense of sovereignty. The British gained control of Hong Kong, and China was forced to open 5 major ports to foreign trade, setting a precedent for future foreign domination. This treaty, along with the other unequal treaties that followed, marked the beginning of a century of subjugation. The Opium Wars not only stripped China of its dignity, but also undermined the very foundations of its ancient empire. Yet, the legacy of the Opium Wars is not just one of defeat and humiliation. It is also a story of resistance and resilience. In the wake of these wars, China experienced a series of reform movements, both internal and external, that aimed to reclaim its independence. The humiliation suffered by the Qing dynasty galvanized many to push for change. Reforms like the self-strengthening movement sought to modernize China's military and industry to avoid further defeats, although it was largely unsuccessful. The failure of these early reform efforts only further fueled the desire for change and contributed to the eventual fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The Opium Wars also sparked a deep sense of nationalism within the Chinese people. The pain of subjugation and the desire to regain sovereignty became central to the Chinese identity. Movements like the Boxer Rebellion, which occurred at the turn of the 20th century, were expressions of this newfound resolve to expel foreign influence from China. While these rebellions were ultimately suppressed, they represented a powerful rejection of foreign imperialism and a desire to return to a more self-sufficient and sovereign China. In the years that followed the fall of the Qing dynasty, the struggle for China's identity and place in the world continued. The rise of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, in the mid-20th century was, in many ways, a continuation of the resistance that had begun during the Opium Wars. The CCP, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, framed the struggle for Chinese sovereignty as a fight against both domestic corruption and foreign exploitation. The humiliation of the Opium Wars, along with the centuries of foreign domination that followed, played a significant role in shaping China's post-revolutionary foreign policy. The experience of foreign intervention during the Opium Wars pushed China to pursue a more self-reliant, self-determined path, free from the influence of Western powers. Today, China's foreign policy is deeply rooted in the lessons learned from the Opium Wars. The desire to protect its sovereignty and maintain control over its economic and political affairs is a central tenet of Chinese diplomacy. The historical memory of the Opium Wars is still invoked in Chinese rhetoric, particularly when the country faces foreign pressure or intervention. The modern Chinese leadership, from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, has repeatedly emphasized the importance of China standing up for itself on the world stage and rejecting any form of external control. The lessons of the Opium Wars are not just historical. They continue to shape China's approach to global challenges today. The Opium Wars also had lasting effects on China's society. The wars and the subsequent foreign domination exposed deep flaws within the Qing dynasty, and the inability to defend the country from external threats led to widespread dissatisfaction. The social upheaval caused by the opium addiction epidemic, combined with the political chaos of the late Qing period, left the Chinese people feeling vulnerable and powerless. These challenges spurred intellectuals, reformers, and revolutionaries to seek new ways to modernize China and regain control of its future. For all the suffering and destruction the Opium Wars caused, they also set in motion a process of transformation that ultimately gave rise to modern China. The desire for national renewal and the fight for sovereignty became driving forces behind the Chinese Revolution and the eventual establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The resilience of the Chinese people, who endured decades of foreign exploitation, was instrumental in China's emergence as a global power. The Opium Wars were, in many ways, a defining moment in Chinese history. They not only marked the end of China's imperial past, but also ignited a period of profound national reflection. The wars taught the Chinese people harsh lessons about the consequences of imperialism, the importance of self-strengthening, and the need to safeguard their sovereignty. But most importantly, the Opium Wars highlighted the indomitable spirit of a nation that, despite enduring humiliation and exploitation, would rise to reclaim its place in the world. As we look back on the history of the Opium Wars, we see not just a story of defeat, but one of resilience, resistance, and the unyielding drive to regain control over one's future. The legacy of the Opium Wars continues to shape China's journey, reminding the nation of the price of subjugation and the power of national identity in the face of adversity.